Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in today. My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group based in the southwest of Western Australia. For those of you that don't know us, we are a not-for-profit independent landcare organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. You can find out more about us and the work we do on our website, lowerblackwood.com.au. Today's webinar forms part of our Regenerative Agriculture and Practice program, which is supported through the Shire of Augusta Margaret Rivers Environmental Management Fund. Before we kick off today, I would like to acknowledge that our Lower Blackwood catchment and the work that we do falls within Wadandi and Pubbleman Budja, within which our streams and tributaries flow to join the Great Gorbilya, or Blackwood River. We recognise and respect that Wadandi and Pubbleman ancestors and their descendants are the traditional custodians of this country and have a long and continuing connection to this land. Just a few words for newbies, how this webinar will run today. You may have noticed by now that you can hear us but not speak yourselves, and that's deliberate so that we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your question in at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked either during or the presentation or at the end. Also, if you do run into any technical difficulties, just let me know via the chat box and I'll see what I can do for my end. But don't worry if you do have to leave early or drop out. We are recording this session, which I'll be emailing out to you all next week. Okay, to the reason you are all here today, I'm delighted to have presenting Professor Fred Provenza from the Department of Wildland Resources, Utah State University. For the past 30 years, Fred and his team have produced groundbreaking research that has laid the foundation for what is now known as behaviour-based management of livestock, wildlife and landscapes. This research led to the creation in 2001 of a consortium of scientists and land managers from 5 continents called BEHAVE, or Behavioural Education for Human, Animal, Vegetation and Ecosystem Management. Fred has more recently published a book on his research titled Nourishment: What Animals Can Teach Us About Rediscovering Our Nutritional Wisdom. In our webinar today, Fred will give us an insight into this fascinating research with a particular focus on the impact of plant diversity on livestock health. So, without further ado, welcome Fred, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And let's launch into this topic of plant diversity and livestock health. And I want to, while I certainly want to make that the focus of the presentation, I want to tie it in much more broadly as I go along, to include everything from plants and plant diversity, of course, through to how that influences soil, how that influences the health of animals and humans, and even linking it in briefly with climate as well. So I've got a couple of food for thoughts for you that take me back probably 50 years now to when I was first starting research in this area. And what I was doing, I was working in southern Utah, which is in southwestern part of the US. And the idea was to use goats, browsing by goats during the winter time when the shrub blackbrush, which is shown there in the video, the shrub blackbrush is dormant. And we knew that that stimulated production of new growth, and that those new growth twigs were higher in energy and protein and in minerals than the old woody growth that's on these plants. And in doing that, the idea was to try to improve the range, use goats to improve the range for cattle that winter there, spend their entire winters there, and other species of wildlife like deer and bighorn sheep and so forth. But what we found was that most of the goats, 80 to 90% of them, weren't interested at all in eating the new growth, even though we knew it was more nutritious than the older growth. So the question is, why were the goats doing that? Second thing that I saw during the first winter that we were working down there with Angora goats from the Navajo Nation We had 6 pastures set up, and goats in one of the pastures, these goats that you're looking at on the screen, started to eat wood rat houses. These houses are built at the base, in this case here, of juniper trees. They're densely packed vegetation that have bark from the trees put on the outside. Now, blackbrush doesn't look good, but wood rat houses look even worse. So why were the goats doing that is the question. I was a grad student at that time, a young grad student, and when I went back to Utah State University and started describing to my professors what I was seeing, they reacted pretty much in the same way. And one of the toxicologists that I knew said, quote, "I guess that just goes to show that domestic animals lack nutritional wisdom." Now, the idea at that time was that wild species clearly must have it. How else can they do what they need to do in landscapes? But that domestic animals had lost that. So I'm going to embed this issue of diversity within this broader notion of nutritional wisdom and link those as I go along. Now, if you think about it, nobody has to tell bacteria, wild insects, fish, birds, mammals, how to eat, what to eat, how to develop, how to replicate. Obviously, they're successful at doing that or they wouldn't be here. Through studies that we and many other people did over the years, we know that domestic animals, goats, sheep, cattle, and wild as well, are challenged to select diets from hundreds of species of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees, each unique biochemically. On the rangelands that we work with, and I know they're in Western Australia, you have incredible diversity. What we learned so well over those years is that some species and plant parts are nutritious, others are toxic. Individual plants can be nutritious or toxic depending on the time of day, the week, and the season. So it's a moving target. And to make matters even more complex, on the resources available in the environment where the plant's growing. That orange plant there in the foreground is called paintbrush. If it's growing on a fertile site, it's different chemically from if it's growing on an infertile site. If it's growing in the sun, different from in the shade. Growing in a wet year, different from in a dry year. So all these factors are influencing what's available to animals, and they become challenges that the animals face. How do you select what you need to meet your nutritional needs during different stages of life? And how do you avoid things that could be toxic? As we know, many of these plants are toxic. And as I've been saying, we know that these plants are responding biochemically to sunlight, moisture, nutrients, other plants growing with them, as well as past use by herbivores. So herbivores are needing to meet these kinds of challenges. So the question is, how do animals know how to meet needs for nutrients as well as medicines? Can they self-medicate? We know that many species, from insects to primates, are able to self-medicate. How can they do that without nutritionists, pharmacists, and veterinarians there to help them along the way? So let's talk about that and embed this notion of diversity within these 3 areas. What I'll refer to as flavor feedback relationships, which I'll start with, then the whole social cultural part of things. We often focus on genetics, and certainly genetics are important, but you know what? Genes only account for a small portion of what animals are able to do in terms of form, function, and behavior. Much of what, well over 50, 60, 70% of what they're doing is learned kind of behaviors that involve epigenetics and gene expression. So, and this whole social cultural part of things becomes absolutely essential. And then the whole idea of diversity, wholesome foods and a variety of different foods. So let's talk about these topics and with relationship to the wisdom of the body and the importance of plant diversity. So I'm going to start with this idea of flavor feedback relationships and say that this is more than a matter of taste. And if I were to ask you this whole question of palatability, as I was a grad student and young faculty member, and that was very confusing for everyone involved. What is palatability? If I were to ask you why you like a particular food, you'd tell me because it tastes good. If I were to ask you why you don't like a particular food, you'd tell me it tastes bad. And that's absolutely true. The odor and taste of food, the flavor, that is to say, is fundamentally important in selection of foods for human beings and for wild domestic animals as well. But what we learned that's so fundamental to this idea of diversity is that palatability is more than a matter of taste. The choices that animals make are influenced by feedback. That feedback is coming from these so-called primary compounds, energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and this diverse array of secondary compounds, the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of compounds that plants produce that we'll talk more about as we go. So cells and organ systems are changing our liking for the flavor of food, changing liking for the flavor of food as a result of feedback. And this isn't something that creatures think consciously about. It's happening at a totally non-cognitive level. If I were to ask you, how many of you think about which enzymes to release to digest the food that you eat? No one would say that they are. It's the same with feedback. This is happening at a non-cognitive level, and it's the way that cells and organ systems are able to get their needs met. That becomes the basis for nutritional wisdom. So how did we come to that conclusion? We did hundreds and hundreds of studies over a 45-year period to address that question in one way or another. And we started by asking this question of, do nutrients alter liking for food? And the way that we would do this is we'd make animals mildly, not strongly, mildly deficient in a nutrient. We did this energy with protein, ratios of energy to protein, minerals. Some of our friends and colleagues out there in Western Australia did it with vitamins like vitamin E. And so what we do is make animals mildly deficient. Then we'd run through trials. So on odd days, animals in one group, in studies we did, would get apple flavored. I'm going to show you a video with straw. So let's talk about straw. We take straw, we flavor it with apple. For one group, give them that for about a half an hour. The other group would get maple flavored straw for the short meal. Then after the meal, we drench them with water. That only makes sense in relation to what we did on even days. We'd switch the flavors so that animals in group 1 now get maple, animals in group 2 get apple flavored straw. And after the meal now, we drench them with the nutrient that they're lacking. So the idea is then when we give them a choice between apple and maple flavored straw, will animals in group 1 prefer maple to apple, and animals in group 2 prefer apple to maple? And that's exactly what we found over and over and over again. Whatever flavors we used, is that animals were associating the flavor of the food with feedback from the nutrients. Now, Kate, if you want to move ahead and bring up that video, I'll show you what that looks like in real life. We have two groups of sheep here that Kate's going to show you. One group, after they ate straw, was drenched with water. The other group was drenched with a nutrient that they were lacking, and it doesn't take you long to see the difference in their use of the straw. Okay, Kate, so that'll do it. So the one group absolutely loves straw, and the other group can't figure out why they want it. The first studies we did, we ran with energy because we figured if you can't condition a preference with energy, you can't condition it with anything. And this quote from Dave Barry really hit the nail on the head. If you simply add feedback to what we were doing, he says, what are calories? Calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature so that we would have a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none. That's exactly it. If you add the feedback term to what he's talking about. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about that. That's exactly what the food industry has figured out related to human beings and what they've done with the development of ultra processed foods and so on and so forth. But that's another topic for discussion. But what we found then is that these metabolically mediated flavor feedback associations alter liking for food as a function of need. We did it with primary compounds in a whole bunch of different forms, with energy, cellulose, starch, glucose, volatile fatty acids, protein. We worked with non-protein, nitrogen, rumen degradable protein, bypass protein. We looked at protein to energy ratios and rates at which protein and energy ferment relative to one another. And ruminants are very, very sensitive to that. They're tuned into it. We looked at minerals, all those that you see there. And then, as I mentioned, Dean Revell and colleagues worked with vitamin E out there in Western Australia. And in every case, what we found is that the more adequate the food was nutritionally relative to need, the higher the preference. You know, you can have too much of anything. Too much protein is toxic. Too much minerals is toxic. Too much vitamins. Same with energy. So it's really a balancing act. And deficits and excesses cause food avoidance, strong food avoidance. We then were working with these secondary compounds, phenolics, alkaloids, terpenes, and so forth. And in the early days, we were finding, you know, people were looking at them as defenses, the compounds that plants produce to protect themselves. But what we were finding with these compounds is that depended on the dose too. And what we came to learn is that they can have health benefits. I'm going to talk more about that in plant diversity as we go. Those compounds have powerful health benefits. So they can serve as nutrients and they can also serve as medicines. We'll get into that more as we go along. So to just kind of quickly sum up and reiterate then, these flavor feedback associations involve phytochemicals, that is primary and secondary compounds, interacting with cells and organ systems, including the microbiome. And I'll talk briefly about that as we go, in a dynamic network of communication. These relationships, and I'm not going to talk about this, are mediated by nerves like the vagus nerve that innervates the digestive system, and that nerve goes directly to the brain stem and meets up with nerves for taste, neurotransmitters, peptides, and hormones. And that becomes the basis then for the nutritional wisdom of the body to meet needs for nutrients and to self-medicate, as we'll talk about as we go along here. So why do goats avoid eating more nutritious, the new growth of blackbrush? The new growth is extremely high in a particular kind of condensed tannin that's really deterrent to 80 to 90% of the goats. And so they learn, and we did several experiments to show they're learning very quickly. After they sample that, they learn that that's bad and they avoid it. So it's the tannins that are causing them to avoid the new growth. And going back to this idea of animals don't have nutritional wisdom, they indeed do have nutritional wisdom. They know that in this particular case here, the most nutritious stuff is also the highest in compounds that can be harmful to them. Why do goats eat wood rat houses? If you remove the bark from those houses and look inside, there are many rooms to those houses, including one that's the bathroom that's soaked in urine. Well, what that becomes is a non-protein source of nitrogen. And those goats in that particular pasture there performed better than the goats in the other 5 pastures at that study site throughout the 3-month period, winter period that we had them. because they were getting this nitrogen supplement. They really needed that down there during the wintertime, eating the blackbrush, which is low in protein. And so they did better by figuring that out. What's interesting to me is of 18 groups of goats during 3 winters, that's the only group of goats that ever figured that out. And what it lets you know, when it comes to locally adapted animals, when you have a herd that's learned how to use an environment, that's learned how to use resources in that environment, not just wood rat houses, but where and where not to go to forage, and where different plants are at different times of the year, that becomes critically important for the health and survival. It's a part of what it means to be locally adapted to a landscape. Now, if we'd have wanted all the goats to eat wood rat houses, we simply would have had to take a goat that was trained and knew how to do that, put it in with the naive goats, and they would have all been eating wood rat houses. So with that, let's move then more directly into this notion of transgenerational linkages to landscapes and the whole social, cultural facet of eating. We know from many, many studies, a very, very interesting work, that these natal experiences influence food and habitat preferences in a broad range of taxa, everything from insects to fish to birds and to mammals. They're all learning about the environments they inhabit. If I had time, I'm not going to take it, I could tell you stories about every one of those photos up there on that screen right now, including the earthworms who are learning about food and habitat preferences, right on through to the birds, to the mammals, and to the cetaceans. But suffice it to say, learning what and what not to eat, where and where not to go to find food, having old, mature animals that know the range is fundamentally important to all of these creatures. So it's no surprise when we started our studies 50 years ago that it was easy to show that mother had such a profound influence not only on food selection, and I'm not even going to talk about habitat selection, the huge role that mother plays in young animals learning where to go in an environment. We know that mother's influence begins in the womb. The fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the foods that mother's eating is getting the young animals familiar with what's food in the environment. After birth, flavors of foods that mother's eating get into her milk. Those become other cues for a young animal of what food is. Then when the young animal begins to forage, mother is a model. It was so easy and so fun to show. You train mother to eat one food and avoid another food. How powerful an influence that has initially on the young offspring, what they learn to eat. So no question about those transgenerational linkages and the importance of that. I want to broaden that out a little bit and put it in a context. So what's mother doing? Mother is helping her offspring to become familiar with what's food in the environment. And that helps to prevent poisoning. You know, I worked for many years with people at the Poisonous Plants Research Lab in Logan. And when you put animals into totally unfamiliar environments, the likelihood of them making mistakes, of eating plants that are toxic, goes way up. And I could tell you story after story after story, but will suffice it to simply say that this whole idea of mother as a transgenerational link and this familiar novel dichotomy is critical. So if nutritional state is adequate, animals okay on nutrients, familiarity then breeds content. Novelty, unfamiliar, breed contempt, and animals are what people call neophobic. They're cautious of novel foods. We showed this over and over again. This is intake of rice by animals that have never seen rice before. And notice on day 1, they hardly eat any of it. Day 2, a little more. 3, they go up, up, up. Now we add a flavor they've never seen before, never experienced. Down they go and back up. This is totally functional kind of behavior. It's helping them, with mother's help originally, to discriminate familiar from novel foods and to be cautious of novel foods. That prevents poisoning. When we also looked in this way, if we offered animals familiar foods, in this case here, barley, oats, alfalfa, and corn, and then we offered them a novel food, a food they'd never seen before, rye in this case here, and we followed that with a toxin dose. So we just drench them with a mild dose of a compound that's potentially toxic. It causes nausea in them is what happens. The next day, what do? On day one, they ate all 5 of those foods. On day 2, they avoid the novel food, not the familiar foods. That's how all of this is working and the functional significance of all that. And that top slide there, oxalates, that plant there is called halogeton. And it's a case study example of how when you take animals, in this case here, 1,000 sheep, and you put them in a totally unfamiliar environment, you put them there when they're very hungry, you move them from miles away, put them there. When they eat that plant, they ended up dead. They lost 1,000 sheep, and it's a huge classic example from back in the 40s or 50s here in the Western United States. It's illustrating all that I'm talking about. Mimicine in your part of the world. Now, the point I want to broaden this out to make, where there's huge focus nowadays on the microbiome. It's important. Feedback is coming from the microbiome in addition to cells and organ systems. And ruminant nutritionists have been studying links between microbes and herbivores for over 75 years. Human nutritionists are just barely starting into this world. But what they were knowing is that diets rich in these secondary compounds stimulate diverse populations of microbes that can degrade these secondary compounds and enable herbivores to eat plants they otherwise couldn't eat. Let's start with the oxalates there that are in halogeton, that plant on the top. If those sheep had been given a couple of weeks to gradually increase their intake of halogeton, they wouldn't have been poisoned. Why? Because there are bacteria in their gut that degrade oxalates. So that whole familiar novel dichotomy and cautious sampling becomes very functional in real life. Mimicine is an example from your part of the world in Mimosa, and it's the same thing. And some researchers from Australia many years ago knew that cattle in Australia were poisoned by this plant, but that livestock in Hawaii weren't. They thought it probably had to do with microbes that were able to degrade mimicine. So they took rumen fluid from animals in Hawaii, brought it to animals in Australia, and sure enough, no more poisoning. So just trying to tie this in with several different factors here related to what we're talking about. So learned patterns of behavior enable experienced animals to better use forages in a landscape. Here are 2 plants on the top. This is bitterbrush that I'm pointing out. This is sagebrush, the bane of many people in the Western United States. What we've learned is that an appetizer of bitterbrush, if animals eat just a little bit of bitterbrush, they can eat far more sagebrush than if they don't have bitterbrush in their diet. Bitterbrush as an appetizer helps the sagebrush to go down. Tannins it's tannins in the bitterbrush that are probably binding with terpenes in the sagebrush. Now, I was telling Kate that I just read a draft book by a lady named Nan Bray in Tasmania. And it's a wonderful, wonderful account of her coming along on this journey that I'm talking about here. And she tells a way interesting story about a sheep, a ewe, that was having problems. I won't go into all the background, but Nan was spending time with her out in the field. And she said it was amazing to watch her, because what she would do is she would eat plants in this sequence. She would eat chicory, then she would eat lucerne, then she would eat plantain, then she would eat clover. And grass was her last choice. What she was doing is sequencing her foods in ways that are very functionally significant, just as I'm talking about here with bitterbrush and sagebrush. And so the diversity of foods with different kind of compounds is enabling animals that have learned how to do it to better utilize the environments they inhabit. So let me just summarize then here on this transgenerational linkages, is that experiences early in life influence gene expression epigenetically, which influences form, function, and behavior. We know that from work that was done in Western Australia with saltbrush, there's enhanced kidney function when a fetus is exposed through its mother to saltbrush in utero. Animals are better able to, sheep are better able to use saltbrush. Their kidneys function more efficiently when they're on high salt loads and so forth. We were showing here altered rumen development. The size of the rumen changes as a function of these experiences early in life. The central nervous system develops differently. All the organ systems of the body are being influenced by these experiences early in life. So let's talk specifically now about more specifically about plant diversity and livestock health. And I want to start out by talking about this idea that I alluded to earlier on, that resource availability influences characteristics of soil, which influences plant diversity and chemistry. All those things are interacting with one another to influence outcomes below and above ground. And I just want to say a few words. So these secondary compounds, as they were called 50 years ago when I first started working in this area. Even before that, they were called waste products of plant metabolism. People didn't know what roles they play. Now what we've learned is they're absolutely essential for the health of plants. They aren't secondary at all. They're every bit as important as minerals and so forth for plants. They act as sunscreen. They serve as antioxidants for plants. They influence the colors of plants. They attract pollinators and fruit eaters. They help plants in interactions with other plants, allelopathic kinds of effects, drought resistance, persistence in the environment. They're very important for recovery following browsing, grazing, injury of the plant, regrowth following grazing, and as I'd alluded to earlier on, they become defenses. Huge, very interesting literature about how these compounds protect plants from being eaten too much by animals, which spreads the load of herbivory across the plant community in diverse communities. So plant mixtures then, as we build on that, plant mixtures influence concentrations of secondary compounds. We know from studies we were doing that growing fescue with alfalfa increases alkaloids in fescue. Alkaloids are nitrogen-based. The alfalfa provides an additional source of nitrogen that helps tall fescue to become even more toxic than it is. Not that you'd want that. Growing trefoil, bird's foot trefoil, or any of those plants chicory, plantain, growing those tannin-containing plants with alfalfa actually decreases tannins in trefoil. All these plants growing with one another, what that is to say is that they're influencing the chemistry of one another. It's amazing to see two studies that are coming out nowadays. This study was published just recently, and it was in the tallgrass prairie here in the central part of the US. And what they showed was after 23 years, plots with diverse array of species, 16 perennial plant species, had 150 to 370% higher levels of nitrogen, potassium, calcium, and magnesium in their plant tissues relative to monocultures of the same species. That's just what I've been saying here before, is that plants growing together are influencing their chemistry, and in this case, they're making one another more nutrition. They also have 30 to 90% more water and nutrient holding carbon in the soil. So the value of diversity can't be overstated in my view. We know from wonderful work that plant ecologists are doing, each plant species harbors a unique rhizosphere community, that is community in its roots, a community of different kind of microbial and microbial species. Diverse mixtures of species interact in ways that enhance the soil microbiome, nutrient availability, and plant chemistry, just as I was alluding to with ruminants. When you have diverse array of species in the diet, so the microbiome of the gut is greatly enhanced for animals. Nutrient inputs from living roots are 2 to 13 times more efficient than litter inputs at forming both slow cycling mineral associated soil organic carbon and fast cycling particulate organic carbon. Nutrients from roots stimulate growth of microbial populations. And this what's amazing, it's the same as in the gut of a ruminant. Dead microbes can make up over 50% of all soil organic carbon, adhering to mineral surfaces and forming soil aggregates. In the ruminant, 80% of the nitrogen requirement of the ruminant is met from dead microbes, the body of microbes in the rumen as they go through the digestive system. So can't overstate how important all of this is in relation to health below and above ground. That's why I like to say plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for animals below, all life below and above ground. And I think nothing is more important for health through nutrition than landscapes with a variety of different plant species. And that goes not only for the herbivores, but also, as I'll talk about as I go along, for omnivores and carnivores as well, below and above ground. Landscapes with diverse arrays of plants are both nutrition centers and pharmacies with this vast array of phytochemicals. You know, we've come to rely on antibiotics and anthelmintics to treat diseases and parasites. How do wild animals do that? They do it with plant species out there in the environments. Wild animals use these phytochemicals to self-medicate themselves. And when it comes to domestic animals, we've learned that there are two ways that they can self-medicate. One is therapeutically. So they get sick, like this poor little guy here, hard night on the town, they get sick. We showed under all these conditions that domestic animals, goats, sheep, and cattle, can learn to self-medicate. They can use plants that are high in tannins for bloat, plants like trefoil, for instance, or any of a number of other tannin-containing plants. The first studies we did, we used bentonite to show that animals in feedlots can use bentonite for acidosis. Dicalcium phosphate for oxalates, polyethylene glycol for tannins. They can use different compounds for external as well as internal parasites, and on and on. I guess a key point that I would make here too is that animals learn to use different plants for different kind of maladies, just like we do. Have a headache, you use aspirin. Have a stomach ache, maybe use Pepto over here or whatever. But animals can learn to self-medicate. And that can be transferred from generation to generation, that knowledge, as we showed in other studies. Animals, though, can also self-medicate prophylactically, that is to say, preventatively. And, you know, back when I was a young grad student, so many people were doing studies of the botanical and chemical composition of the diets of animal X under conditions Y at time Z. And we're just seeing the diverse array of species that animals use, and then how that influenced the nutritional content of their diets. And what we found was that while 3 to 5 plants make up the bulk of the diet, animals will eat 50 to 75 plants in a meal. And what we learned is that health is enhanced when livestock graze phytochemically rich mixtures of grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. There's so much nice research that's coming out on that nowadays. Here's some research at Utah State University that's being published. And I'm happy to share publications if anyone wants. All that I'm saying, there's a lot of publications on them. But health improves when livestock graze diverse mixtures of plants compared to monocultures. We also learning they gain weight more efficiently with less emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, and they can reach slaughter weight nearly as quickly as animals in feedlots when they have really complementary species of different plants. And I'm talking 50 to 75 species on rangelands, but people are showing with 6 species like these on your screen there, animals can perform very, very well in the way that I'm talking about right here now. Work in New Zealand is showing too that this is influencing the fetus and the young lambs after birth. Compared with lambs whose mothers eat only ryegrass during pregnancy, lambs whose mothers eat ryegrass, chicory, plantain, red clover, and alfalfa have less oxidative and metabolic stress at lambing, and they birth heavier lambs with lower levels of cortisol in the wool. So here's these effects taking place in the womb and early in life. Here's work from New Zealand that's more on that same topic, and that they're showing is that a diverse diet increases lamb growth and carcass yield. And they're looking at monocultures versus 6 species mixtures like this one right here, and finding some really amazing kind of results in terms of the health of the animals and the growth and carcass yields. They're also finding that when plants are planted in patches as opposed to intermixed. So intermixed is here on the left side of the screen, here patches, however you would do that. Performance is much better in patches than in these integrated mixtures. That goes back to work that was done years ago with sheep and with dairy cows. And if you think, well, why would that be? If you think of a dairy cow that has to eat that much forage in a day, what it really has to do with is efficiency. It's much more efficient to be able to go into patches and forage than to try to pick and choose amongst all these things closely mixed together. And so years ago, people were showing that increase of 25% in intake, the amount that sheep were eating in grass clover pastures planted in patches versus intermixed. Dairy cows, increase of 11% in milk production. So not only is diversity important, but the way that diversity is presented is very important. So it's not a wonder then that livestock producers are finding morbidity and mortality decrease when they're offering mixtures of plants as opposed to monocultures. These phytochemicals have antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory, and prebiotic properties that result in robust animals tolerant of diseases, is the bottom line here. So I remember years ago giving a talk something like this to livestock producers, and a man came up to me after that and he said, "This really explains what I saw." He said, "I put 4 daughters through college on a mix. It's not a widely diverse mix, but he said a mix of Sericea, Lespedeza, and endophyte infected tall fescue. Those would really be considered by many people the plants from hell here in the United States." Well, what he was doing is Sericea is high in tannins, tall fescue is high in alkaloids. The tannins are binding to the alkaloids, and it's preventing the adverse effects of both Sericea and tall fescue if they were eaten in monoculture. I've already talked briefly about this. I mentioned that these sequences, not only complementarities, but sequence of an appetizer of bitterbrush helps sagebrush go down. Appetizer of trefoil or chicory is going to help the endophyte infected tall fescue go down for the reasons that I've been talking about. So there's a livestock producer here in Idaho that I've become good friends with. Glenn Elzinga is his name. And what he does, he produces some of the highest quality meat that anyone does in the United States from these rangelands like you're looking at here. And he uses shepherding. He's moving these animals across the landscapes, and he's got some 400 different plant species, he's told me, on those rangelands. What he did, he read this book, The Art and Science of Shepherding, and it's talking about diversity and how shepherds use diversity and how important that is for nurturing the health of soil, plants, herbivores, and humans. And Glenn has been incredibly successful at doing that. Well, what shepherds do in France that we were talking about in that book is they use different habitat types to create different sequences in a meal to make up different meals. And so you may be able to see there here, this says first rate over here. This is very appreciable, good, passable, disgusting, if you insist. What they do is to figure out how to use appetizers, like I was saying, appetizer or bitter brush helps the sagebrush go down, and so on and so forth. And then appetizers, main courses, booster stages, desserts, and that enables them to utilize all the plants in a community so they don't overutilize one part of the community and underutilize the other. This Nan Bray in Tasmania that I mentioned earlier has just done some fabulous, fabulous work along these lines with shepherding and with training her locally adapted sheep to utilize the landscapes to the point where she's no longer even necessary. They have learned how to do this mixing. But these grazing circuits enable individuals, I haven't said anything about it, but when you get studying this stuff, no two animals are alike, not even close. And not only in form and function, but then in behavior and in their needs. Offering diverse arrays of species allows individuals to individuality to be expressed. Stimulates appetite and intake, and then it allows you to target graze to enhance and maintain biodiversity, which is very important in some of the work that has been done with shepherds in France and that Glenn Elzinga is doing on his landscapes here in Idaho. So let's scale up a little bit and talk about plant diversity and human health and the importance of that. And so plant diversity and chemistry, as I've been saying, are fundamentally important for the health of livestock. Biochemical richness of their diets influences the quality then of milk, cheese, and meat. All these rich arrays of phytochemicals are getting into what we would consider the products. Let me step back and make a couple points before we launch straight into that. This book here, The Dorito Effect, that Mark Shaxter wrote, published several years ago, is an amazingly good book. It's short, it's really good, but the point that he's making related to this idea of what happens when animals are on diverse diets is that the flavor of meat and produce have become incredibly bland throughout most of certainly in the US, probably in Australia as well. Any country that's gone to these CAFO operations, the richness of the meat is going to decline. At the same time, processed foods have become irresistible. So what has happened is we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've made junk food all the more desirable. We know that phytochemical richness declined from 10 to 50% in most fruits and vegetables during the last 50, 75 years, we can say now. Has to do with all the things I was talking about. Water and fertilizer alter chemistry of plants. They may make it better. They make it worse. They may dilute compounds in foods. The varieties we select for. We've really selected for yield as opposed to phytochemical and biochemical richness, which is what matters most. Then we pick things green and ripen them in transit. And so we have these here in the States anyway, fruits and vegetables, as I'm showing there, that look great, but no young kid or no old kid wants to eat them. Why? Because they have no flavor. And what's that telling the body, the cells and organ systems? There's nothing in here that's really worth eating. I've made this point over and over again that phytochemical richness and flavor depend on the plant variety and the site where a plant's growing. There's a variety of corn that my wife and I loved to grow when we were living in Utah. The flavor was incredible. Grow it here in Montana on different soils under different climatic conditions. It's horrible. That's the environment influencing that. in Mexico. I traveled down there years ago and went to all these little restaurants all over the country, and the flavors of foods were incredible. You could tell they were still selecting for varieties and growing conditions that just enhanced flavor something fierce. And these corn tortillas, I've never had anything that flavorful before or after that in my life. One of the things that people do, this idea of the three sisters that was so well known that indigenous peoples did here in the U.S., where they grow corn, squash, and beans together. The beans provide nitrogen, corn provides cover, and so forth. But what they find is that the nutrient content of those plants is much higher when you grow the three sisters together, as opposed to in monoculture, just like I was saying earlier for rangeland plants. So now if we start to scale up to ruminants, what people find, and this was some studies done years ago in Italy, when dairy cows graze botanically diverse swards as opposed to eating a total mixed ration of cultivated forages and grains, the flavor and biochemical richness of their milk and cheese is greatly enhanced, and the local peoples much prefer that to the feedlot fed animals. The flavor of meat is influenced by phytochemical richness of the diet, and we know very little about how that affects the quality of the phytochemical and biochemical richness of meat, the flavor, the quality, satiety, and human health. But there's a lot of research going on nowadays in that regard. I'm going to talk briefly about that here. I'm going to set the stage by talking about this Warren Angus Ferris and his book, Life in the Rocky Mountains, a diary of wanderings on the sources of the Missouri, Columbia, and Colorado rivers back from 1830 to 1835. It's a fascinating diary to read, but the part that I want to make a point of here is he's talking about bison, and that is a food source for them during their adventures. He said, bison in poor flesh were the worst diet imaginable. But as they became fat, quote, we grew strong and healthy, and now not one of us but is ready to insist that no other kind of meat can compare with that of a female bison in good condition. He goes on to say, with it we require no seasoning. We boil, roast, or fry it as we please and live upon it solely without bread or vegetables of any kind. And what seems most singular, we never tire of or disrelish it, which would be the case with almost any other meat after living upon it exclusively for a few days. I went quickly on that, but just think of what he's saying. They don't need seasoning. Why? The phytochemical richness of the diet is providing the seasoning. They don't get tired of it. We did study after study to show that animals, cattle, sheep, goats tend not to get tired of foods that are really meeting their nutritional needs. The more adequate a food is, the less animals get tired of it. That's what he's talking about. This meat is very much meeting their needs. So Stefan von Vliet at Utah State University is really a key person that's doing research. He and his graduate students. He's linked with producers across the world nowadays. They're studying everything from chickens to pigs to deer to goats, sheep, and cattle, of course, and comparing meat from feedlots with meat from animals eating phytochemically rich diets. They're doing three kinds of analyses. One is metabolomics analyses, and what that, don't need to go into details. It simply allows you to look at a vast array of different compounds that get into meats. You can look at thousands of these different compounds, as opposed to focusing, for instance, on simply omega-3 to omega-6 ratios in meat. You can look at this broad array and you can start to say, what kind of health benefits can this have? So that's one kind. I'm going to talk about that. Doing feeding trials for inflammation, looking at inflammatory markers, talk more about that. And then right now he's got a PhD student doing some incredible clinical trials looking at satiety, how satisfied you are, how much you need to eat to feel satisfied, inflammation, and health. So let me just touch on those briefly. One of the studies we did, there's a whole bunch here worldwide now looking at plant-based meats. And if you look at the nutrition labels of plant-based meats versus ground beef, and the meat that we used in this study came from Glenn Elzinga, the person I was talking about that has this incredible diversity in the diets of animals. If you look at the nutrition labels, they look similar, but when you look at the phytochemical and biochemical richness of Glenn's meat versus a soy or pea-based product, they're not even in the same universe. It's so much more diverse with the ground beef that's coming from animals eating these diverse diets. We've been doing metabolomic studies with all these creatures I mentioned. Let me just use bison as an example here. In this case, this meat came from bison on either foraging on diverse rangelands or fed in pens. And in this case here, it wasn't just a total mixed ration. They were offered a choice of alfalfa hay, meadow hay, and corn as their choices. So they had a bit of diversity in their diet. Nevertheless, when we looked at phytochemicals and phytochemical richness, it was vastly higher in the bison foraging on rangelands. Their meat was much higher in antioxidants, the anti-inflammatory compounds, less oxidative stress. Stefan is a human nutritionist by training, and it was interesting to hear what he said. He said the bison finished in pens showed early signs of metabolic syndrome due to the diets. They were eating a lot of grain and the lifestyle. They got no exercise. He said their tissues are very similar to what you would see in human tissues of an athlete, that is an animal foraging on rangelands, or a human athlete versus a couch potato for the human or the animals in pens. You may or may not realize this, but there's an inflammatory response takes place in our bodies every time we eat a meal, with increasing odds of developing diseases when meals that elevate inflammation become dietary habits. And these on the left there are typically considered pro-inflammatory kinds of compounds or foods or whatever. And then on the right, anti-inflammatory herbs, spices, vegetables and fruits, wholesome foods and so forth are considered to be more anti-inflammatory. The others pro-inflammatory. And notice that red meat and fat are typically considered to be pro-inflammatory. We know, though, that phytochemically rich herbs and spices are antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And when they're added to foods, for instance, indigenous people here in the US added herbs and spices to enhance palatability, satiation, and satiety. And people would argue nowadays they reduce the alleged adverse effects of eating red meat. So Native Americans here in this country made pemmican from meat and wild berries, and that would be having these kind of influences. One of the most interesting studies I read about back in about 2010 came out of Australia. It was researchers at Sydney, and what they did was to compare cattle, Wagyu cattle, fed a total mixed ration in the feedlot with kangaroos foraging on rangelands. And what they found then, when they fed people meat from the Wagyu or the kangaroo, was that inflammatory responses were much greater after eating meat from Wagyu, fed the high grain diet, than meat from kangaroos eating a phytochemically rich diet. And that's been shown in other studies as well now. That was the only study at the time. When I wrote them after that study, I said, are you going to do these studies with cattle fed in feedlot versus diverse diets? And they said, no, we're not. Our point is that If you live in Australia and you want to eat meat that's better for you, eat kangaroo. And as you know, and as I know after living for a year in Australia, you can get kangaroo right there in the stores. So all that I'm talking about then, this phytochemical diversity, is leading to phytochemical richness in meat and fat, and that's decreasing inflammatory responses when people eat meat that comes from animals that are eating diverse diets. That's also true with traditionally processed meats. Typically, human nutritionists like to show that when you eat processed meats, you have a higher risk of colon cancer. But there's no evidence of that in Morocco. And people argue that the reason for that, one reason, is that the way that they process the meats, they mix them with olive oil, herbs, and spices such as cumin, garlic, coriander, salt, and vinegar, and that's mitigating that inflammatory kind of response that over time can lead to cancer. We know that phytochemicals can reverse epimutations and prevent diseases, which is promising because epigenetic changes are more easily reversible than genetic changes. So if we were to look at each one of these different plant foods and compounds and so forth, histone modification, DNA methylation, there's a paper that's talking about these kinds of things. Diet-induced changes in DNA methylation can counter all the hallmarks of a cancer cell. That ties in nicely with what they're finding in Morocco. So to make a long story short, then, meat isn't meat isn't meat, and dairy isn't dairy isn't dairy. When you come right down to it, this is changing, but our understanding of how diet affects health is limited to 150 nutritional components. These compounds are a small fraction of the tens of thousands of phytochemicals and biochemicals in the human foodome, and that get into these different foods depending upon whether it's vegetables, fruits, nuts, meat, dairy, as I've been talking about. Here's, just to drive that point further home, here's chemicals in oregano. That's a partial list of the compounds that are in one herb. So when you start to eat these diverse arrays of plants in a meal, it becomes incredibly complex. Biochemicals interact with one another in the cells and organ systems in extremely complex ways. We're never going to fully understand that. It's simply beyond what reductionist science can do. Consider the biochemical complexity of a meal of sautéed spinach, ginger, whole grain ravioli shells stuffed with butternut squash, spices topped with walnut tomato sauce, or a meal of 10 to 50 species of grass forbs and shrubs for herbivores. You reach a point where what you come to appreciate is simply that phytochemical and biochemical complexity and diverse mixtures of plants is really critical for the health of animals, and then you can let all the specifics go. And then if you go back to what I talked about at the very beginning here, this wisdom of the body, and if you have humans that are, which isn't the case much nowadays, honestly, but that are raised on wholesome foods starting in utero and early in life, the wisdom of their own body is what can guide them to nourishing foods and diets. Okay, Kate, I have a question for you here. Can you hear me? I've got one short section here. I can either do this to sum it up, or we can let it go and just go to question and answer. You let me know what you prefer.
Well, I think we're happy to keep going. We've still got a big audience here, and they're obviously very interested in what you're saying. So
okay, I'll sum it up, and I'll try to run through this quickly. I'm putting all the pressure on you, Kate. Not meaning to do that, but I want some time. I'm also glad too if people have questions or comments or anything to do that. So I'll keep it going. I'll do it quickly, and then we can.
Well, I'll just say, perhaps people could start thinking about any questions they would like to ask and put them into the chat box, so that when Fred's finished his summing up, we have some questions to ask. That'd be good.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so two spiritual dangers. You know, during the last 15,000 years, our species transformed from hunters and gatherers. And we were all doing that, right? We were all indigenous not that long ago. We talk, you know, the amazing 50,000 years that Aboriginals in Australia and 12 to 15,000 years in this country. But all of our ancestors were indigenous not that long ago. Um, and we transformed it during the last 15,000 in the US, transformed from hunters and gatherers to farmers, you know, pastoralists and small scale farms and ranches, which I think is a quite different thing from the huge industrial agriculture where we've gone now. And I'm not criticizing in any way, just saying that there are big differences. And I think the degree to which we're linked to landscapes is inversely related as you go from hunter gatherers to pastoralists, small farm ranches, and then to industrial agriculture. Kate, did I share with you that thing, cosmic dreaming?
No, I don't think
I'll
so.
share that with you, and please feel free to share it with this audience if you'd want. It's a talk I gave the end of June. It's about a 20-minute talk, and I wrote it out, and it really goes into depth on what I'm going to talk about now. It really makes some points. So I'll share that with you, and you can share it with people. But we've really moved, and I talk about this, from ecological economies to fossil fuel-based economies, and that's had huge influence then on all these factors that we've been talking about. So nowadays, to produce a calorie of food requires 2 calories of fossil fuels for machinery, fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, all the antibiotics and allebenics. Then we use another 8 to 12 calories to process, package, deliver, store, and cook modern food. Now, if you think of a wild creature, a wild insect, or whatever it is, or bird, or mammal, or a bacteria, there's no way you can expend 12 to 14 calories to get 1 calorie in. You can't make it. You're not going to survive. And yet that's where we are nowadays with fossil fuels and what's happening with that. That's a whole other topic too that could really be that I've explored in papers I've been asked to write. So, you know, if it's true that by mid-century oil and natural gas are pretty much done for, that has huge implications for what we're doing. In this cosmic dreaming that I'll send you, I talk about how climate change is a product of an extractive economy that's forcing us to confront the outcome of our consumptive lifestyle. And that's certainly the case here in the US. Genuine scarcity for which the markets has no remedy. You know, if you think of where markets are and economies, and again, I'm not trying to be the big critic, but they're based on scarcity and competition rather than abundance and cooperation, which is what I talk about. And this here is really about abundance and cooperation. And okay, so we can't change the whole economy of the US, for instance, but our individual interactions with one another and the people in our community, we can do that. We can create regenerative economies that cherish and reciprocate the gifts. And that can become a path forward, as I talk about in that cosmic dreaming. I see such hugely important, always and forever, roles of farmers and ranchers, but nowadays can produce foods in ways that nurture relationships among soil, water, diverse species of plants, herbivores, farmers, ranchers, and consumers. And I think agriculture can play such a key role as it has for a long time, and become the heart of communities. But from soil and plants to livestock and humans, we need to learn what it means to be locally co-evolving with nature's communities. I talk about the importance of communities in cosmic dreaming, and moving from ecological, that we're on top, authoritarian, dualistic, and so forth, to ecological, we're members of nature's communities, to thinking of ourselves in that sense. So that takes me to Aldo Leopold, who was thinking about this back many years ago in the 30s and 40s, and wrote that wonderful book, A Sand County Almanac. back in the 40s, so 75 or so years ago. He said there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, the other that heat comes from the furnace. To avoid the first danger, one should plant a garden, preferably where there's no grocer to confuse the issue. To avoid the second, he should lay a split of good oak on the andirons, preferably where there's no furnace, and let it warm his shins while a February blizzard tosses the trees outside. He so captured the essence of I think, of our relationship with natural communities. So most people don't own farms and ranches here in the US and probably in Australia as well. But most people have yards that can link us back with wholesome foods and wild plants and animals. This is a view if you were to travel here in Innis, where my wife and I live right now. This is what you'd see on our little acre and a half. It's not a big plot of ground, but you would see a lot of native species growing, all those colorful things. If you were to come right now, you'd see sunflowers everywhere. The place is glow with sunflowers and all the different bird species that are in our yard, from warblers and sparrows and blackbirds and magpies and on and on and on. It's just magnificent to see. They're foraging on all that. Then you'd see our deep beds. You can see our greenhouse there. You can see our chicken coop. You would see our deep beds with all the plants, the different crops that we've grown throughout this year, and the native plants, shrubs that produce berries. So the point I'm trying to make is simply that, yeah, we're not all farmers and ranchers, but we can create diversity. And here in the US, most people grow lawns of one sort or another at huge expense. Over 30,000 tons of synthetic pesticides at a cost of well over $2 billion, not to mention all the herbicides and fertilizers we use to weed and feed our lawns. If any kind of species you don't want, some clover comes up in your grass or some dandelions, what is the first thing people here do? Get rid of it. Put 2,4-D on it. So you poison that stuff. Whatever little diversity, and I've been trying to make that point, how important diversity is, we get rid of it. We haven't learned to appreciate, let alone appreciate, the native species. Over 800 million gallons of gasoline to mow the lawns. A gas-filled refilling lawnmowers is 17 million gallons, 1.57 times the amount spilled by the Exxon Valdez off the shores of Alaska years ago. Here in the arid West, and I know Australia, it's arid too, residual water use outside the home is 30 to 60% of total water use. Depending on the estimate, 7 billion to 9 billion gallons of water are used each day for suburban irrigation. When you have native species growing, they don't need it, right? They've evolved in those environments. And I'm happy to say I see a bunch happening nowadays related to xeriscaping landscapes here and yards. One of the things that's an irony to me, though, a lot of times people would put rocks there. They just get rid of the lot and put rocks. Well, that creates a very harsh environment. Why not plant native plant species that are adapted to the environment is the point that I would make. So we've made an art form of dining around the globe. We've made an art form of dining, but we've tabled larger questions, I think, and they relate to what I've been talking about, and then to this. If you think about it, eating is participating in endless transformation as plants and animals give their lives to sustain our lives. As I eat, energy and matter in someone, and plants and animals are both ones. They're beings, right? They're conscious. There's no question animals are conscious. Plant physiologists make a really good case that plants are conscious, and you watch them. Watch the sunflowers I was talking about as they track the sun. All the things I mentioned about the plants use these secondary compounds for, all the roles that they play and the way that plants are changing allocation. Plants can't get up and walk around and run and talk in the ways that we talk. They do talk through these secondary compounds. They're sending messages all the time to one another and to the animals in the environment. But what I'm trying to say is that, people get into such big fights here in the US over, are you a plant eater or are you an animal eater? And I have good friends that are on both sides of that issue. But the point I try to make is that as I eat energy and matter in someone, because this entity I call, quote, me, which will in the flicker of a cosmic eye return to earth as plants and animals. I often tell Sue, I hope that I die somewhere out in the wilds where I can't be found right away, where the wild animals can simply eat me the way that should be properly done, right? So you return to the earth through the animals that eat you, and then they poop you out and you become plants and so forth, rather than but in pondering these mysteries, I think we may come to realize that all life is sacred, not just animals, not just plants. All life is sacred. We come to treat our relationship with one another and with the landscapes and with the cosmos becomes a spiritual thing. All of it is sacred. We're members of nature's communities. What we do to them, we do to ourselves. Only by nourishing them can we nurture ourselves. I talk a bunch about that in Cosmic Dreaming in my years on the ranch in Colorado. How it was very hands-on. I'm not anti-technology, but I was making a point that sounds that way. How we irrigated by hand. We didn't use pivots. We hauled hay by hand. We didn't use a lot of machines. We moved cattle on horseback all around those landscapes. We didn't use virtual fencing and so forth. And the point I was trying to make, not I'm anti-technology, it's that how do you form a relationship with something if you aren't intimately involved with it? The only way is to be intimately involved, whether it's another person or the landscape. And so for me, we were nurturing the plants and animals, which were in turn then nourishing us. And I've never felt so grounded and centered in my whole life as in those years on the ranch. And that was why we were participating. And then beyond that, we were foraging for wild plants out in the environment. We were hunting deer and elk. We were linked with the environment. So we're members of nature's communities, and I think, let me go back and just segue this better. Only by nourishing them can we nurture ourselves, and nurturing them can we nourish ourselves. And I would say we do that through relationships by declaring love, not war, which we always are wanting to do, on one another and the landscapes we inhabit. And so with that, Kate, I've talked more than I ever should have. I'm hoarse.
No, it's fascinating and a lovely way to end. And I'm sure pretty much you're preaching to the converted here. Everyone who's listening and is listening in because they believe in those things too. But I have a question. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any questions. You've bamboozled everybody. But I do have a question. I suppose I'm curious to know what happens regards livestock health and nutrition during non-growing seasons for pastures. For example, in winter snow-covered pastures that you get in the US or here in our Mediterranean climate, when no pastures are actively growing, unless you have irrigation in the summer, in a sort of farming context, mineral supplementation would be more important in those cases, wouldn't it? Because you're not getting that sort of natural diversity through growing plants.
Yes, it can be more important, Kate, and it really depends on the environment where animals are, and also on their diets during. Many of these compounds, not all of them, can be stored in different organ systems and can last for several months in a body. So if animals are exposed to really diverse, wholesome diets during the growing season, that can bolster them during the dormant season. I think of the ranch I was on in Colorado, and during the spring, summer, and autumn, animals were foraging on really diverse landscapes, and we were moving them around those landscapes throughout those seasons. In the winter, they were back on the home place, And the diet was less diverse, no question about that. And we fed hay. And there again, it depends where the meadow hay comes from. The meadows we were cutting had diverse arrays of species, so that hay was diverse too, if that makes sense to you, so you can start to think of what are you doing. And then depending where they were on the ranch, there were some other, for instance, shrub species. It's really going to depend on, as we all know, on the specific environment, but there were different kinds of shrub species that can be great sources of nutrients during the winter time. And cattle can certainly learn to browse. They can learn to use browse very well. One of the things you mentioned that Behave program that was during that decade of 2000. And one of the things that producers were really interested in that we were working with, and we were working with the most innovative producers we could find, and we were all students learning together. But one of the things they were interested in is how do we cut costs? How do we cut costs of operation? And in our part of the country, the greatest costs were in feeding hay during the winter because people were irrigating, cutting, baling, hauling hay during the summer, labor intensive, machine intensive, and so forth. So were trying to figure how can we get out of that? And again, it depended on the specific place, but there were cases where people could winter their animals out, and they got out of the haying part of things. And that was huge in terms of their bottom line economically. One of the studies we did during those years, some of the studies were related to that. And what we were showing is that if a fetus, the mother was living on a winter diet, which isn't the best quality, a lot of dormant forage and stuff, that after birth, when that young calf started to forage on its own, and when it got onto the winter range, it would eat more poor quality forages more readily than a calf that whose mother never had that exposure in utero. And it could digest those forages better. Think of that. That's epigenetic kind of changes that are going across generations, and that then influence, well, how much nutrient need and how well can animals utilize nutrients and so forth. I hope that makes sense. Those are such key points related to local adaptation and what it means for animals to be locally adapting and evolving in an environment. And you mentioned wanting to do a podcast with Nan. If you could, I'm jumping around on you. But, she writes so much about the changes that took place in her operation over time when she started moving down these paths of appreciating diversity and thinking about how to get diversity into her landscape, and about how her animals learning to use diversity. There's a lot to it, no question, a lot to it. And then what you move toward is more, how do the wild animals that I started with, how do they make their living in the environment, and to what degree can we mimic natural systems and have that benefit us ecologically, economically, and socially in terms of the welfare of animals and people and so forth.
Yeah, I think sort of thinking about the context here, and particularly in our area, it wasn't rangelands, it wasn't grasslands here, it was largely forested. And of course, sheep and cattle are all introduced species. And in the early days, they very quickly ate out all the sort of flowering undergrowth, and then trees, etc., cleared. So most of the pastures here are all exotic species, and very few people have native species. Well, there might be a few native species of grasses, etc., growing, but they're not considered to be highly palatable or nutrition. Whether that's the case or not, I'm not sure. But just going back to what you're talking about, introducing native shrubs, etc., into pastures is potentially a way. We haven't really focused on that in any of our work, but it's certainly something we can look at doing, because in the summer, of course, the native shrubs, etc., are adapted to the climate here, and so it could be a source of green for animals during the summer months instead of just providing hay. So that's definitely something we're interested in looking at for sure.
Yeah, and all that, when we were working, when we had the Behave program going, one of the nice things about it, because all those raise questions, right? I mean, just listening to you, there's a whole bunch of questions there that could be interesting to explore and to try to figure out. And so that's what we were doing with ranchers. And we were still involved in research in those days, and the grad students then would be, their projects would relate to questions that the ranchers had, if that makes sense. So we want to go to winter. Can animals utilize, what can help animals to utilize sagebrush during the wintertime? Well, all this work that was showing that depending on the mix of species that are there and so forth, that you can greatly enhance use of sagebrush. And I'm thinking of, anyway, I better not go on with the stories, but all that raises, raises questions. And then a lot of times you think, well, my animals can't do that. I've never seen them do that, or they've never done this. We had animals doing things in productive ways, in really productive ways that people never imagined that they could do. That used to be fun. And I did this the year I lived in Australia. We had our traveling sheep show, and take them and show them doing things that people never imagined that they can do. I'm not advocating to do things that poison animals or that harm them, but what we don't know the bounds. I mean, all these examples I was giving were animals that have appetizers of this or that and eat a whole bunch more of something else, and the shepherding. All that, people would have said that's impossible. That's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's built on diversity and knowledge of complementarities and sequences and all those kinds of things. And then Nan's book is totally about her learning, her journey to learn. But when she watched Alice, this mature ewe that was in tough shape, when she watched Alice eat those foods in those sequences, chicory first, then lucerne. Chicory's high in tannins, lucerne is high in protein. That combination can prevent animals from bloating, for one, on the lucerne. It's a good complement. And then they go to plantain, and then they go to trefoil. All those make sense in terms of complementarities and sequences, and Alice knew that. And then she said when all those had been used, she'd eat a little grass, but then she'd just stand there and look at Nan and say, okay, isn't it time for you to move me? She was in a sling. Isn't it time for you to move me now? Because I'm tired of eating. I've eaten what I wanted to eat here. And that was the light bulb that went on for Nan to say, oh, I remember hearing something about that by this guy, Fred Provenza, over in the States, but I never followed up on it. So I guess I'm going to start looking at that. And anyway, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but came from her observations there in the field of what Alice was telling her that Alice had figured out. And so
I was really interested, Fred, when there was a slide you put up earlier, which showed planting of multi-species, all mixed in together and then in patches. And I'm just trying to think of that in a domestic context, on our farms, because we've been very busily promoting multi-species pastures and trying to get farmers to, explore trialing different mixes, etc., in our neck of the woods. But one thing I've noticed on my own farm is, and it'll be the same on most people's, is that there's so many different patches, soil type patches across the paddocks, that some things grow well in one patch and other things don't grow in another patch so well. So it sort of makes me think that the way we're seeding in multi-species mixes, maybe we need to think of it slightly differently and start seeding in patches, perhaps. I don't know the practicalities of that, especially at a larger scale. But certainly on my own place, the sort of wet and waterlogged areas, etc., could be sown a different way from the less waterlogged areas, etc. So that's really interesting food for thought, I think.
And you said it perfectly, Kate. You said it perfectly. When you look in natural environments, I'm thinking here in the U.S., I imagine there too, different, as you said, different plant species grow better in different sites, right? Different habitat types and so forth. And that's the way to start to think. And then it's not that you try to create just totally monoculture, I don't think, because I'm going back to that slide that showed those 16 species growing together, and there's complementarities go on there. But trying to think about your landscape and thinking about what would grow best in different parts of that is a way to think about that. And certainly, from the work that was done years ago in the UK, and now the work that Pablo Gregorini's doing on us in New Zealand, just showing that when they put that stuff in patches, but think you can make a patch however big you or small you want it. It's totally up to your ingenuity and creativity and how you do that. There's nothing set. But the idea of efficiency has certainly come up, and Pablo's making and his students making a big deal of that nowadays in terms of growth and carcass characteristics and so forth. So a lot to think about there, right?
Yeah.
A lot to think about in terms of how to do diversity. And, I think just good food for thought. And
It is.
I often like to say, it's trying to understand principles and processes, and then each person, each landholder becomes an artist, I think, and you paint the canvas the way it appeals to you most. You try to quote paint the canvases the way, and there's many ways to do that. Then, right? Many ways to do that, and that they'll all work, and to make it work in ways that best work for you. I'm not one that likes the one size fits all, huh? This is the way that we need to do things, right?
It is. Well, Fred, I mean, I could carry on talking with you for ages, but we are at 10:30, so I think we're going to have to close. And I just had a look, and I'm sorry, there were some questions, but I think we've actually covered them all by now. They were hiding. So thank you once again for your time today. We do spend so much time focusing on improving soil health and using plants as a vehicle to do that. And we do, I think, sometimes lose sight of the other really key importance of plant diversity, which you've very eloquently explained to us today. So fascinating presentation, and I'm sure you said it yourself, given our audience plenty of food for thought. For our audience,
wonderful. Just say wonderful, yes, to be with you, Kate, and with the audience today. It's been a real joy for me. Thank you very much.
Well, and for our audience, just before you sign out, if I could ask you to complete our webinar evaluation form. It's only a couple of minutes, and it's super helpful for us to make sure we are providing the content that's important to you. And also, as promised, I will be emailing out a recording of the webinar, and I'll post it on the Knowledge Bank in our Talkin After Hours online community, along with Fred's PDF presentation. If you're not a member of our community yet, I would strongly encourage you to join. It's free and chock full of great information and opportunities to connect with each other, ask questions and chat with other members on topics like this. So you can register at our website at lowerblackwood.com.au, Talkin After Hours. Okay, well, that's it from me. Thanks once again, Fred. It's evening for you there, about 8 o'clock.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, of course.
I see a question here, and I just can't resist. It's important. Said, I learned at uni only plants produce phytochemicals, but after your talk, I'm a bit confused. Can raising red meat livestock on rangelands, multi-species pasture, cause them to produce phytochemicals? It's true what was learned at uni. Only the plants are producing these phytochemicals. The livestock aren't producing the phytochemicals. What's happening is as they eat these plants with diverse arrays of phytochemicals, those phytochemicals become a part of their meat and fat. I hope that makes sense. It's the phytochemicals themselves that are becoming a part of the meat and fat of the animal. The animal isn't producing them. They're getting them from the plants. And they become a part of the body of the animals then. As manifest in milk and dairy and meat and so forth. So I'll be quiet now, but that's a good question and needs to be answered.
Yeah, no, thanks. I missed that one. Thanks, Jordan, at the end. And I'm just reading back down before I close off. I think there's some great comments from people. Alan Walker says, fantastic presentation. Seems to be so much complexity with the diversity of plants, the order in which to eat them, knowledge of their toxicity at different times and seasons. Solution seems to be human body wisdom. What are some first steps? What are some first steps we can take towards moving to becoming healthier, given our starting point from the ideal? Many thanks. So that's great. Well, I think that's it. And Fred, I'll let you get to dinner if you haven't had it already.
Okay, Kate, many thanks. I'll send you a note with that cosmic dreaming. Share it with the group.
I will do so. And thanks also to the Shire of Augusta Margaret River for their support. And thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day.